Let's get started, guys. So let's review what we talked about last time. So last time we talked about what the whole goal, the whole mission of statistics was. And somebody remind us?
To be able to use a representative sample to judge the outcome of the whole.
Okay, very good. So there's some conclusion you want to make about the whole that we call the population. And we said that in real life, it was infeasible to actually collect data for every data point in the population. So instead, we're forced to use a sample, and we want to know how we can use that sample to actually make an accurate conclusion about the whole population. So that's the whole point of statistics. And so usually the types of conclusions that we end up wanting to make about the population end up being, we want to know some quantity about the population, like a percentage that approve the president. Or we might want to know what the average IQ is for the whole country without having to give the whole country an IQ test. Or we might want to know whether a drug is effective in doing what it claims without giving the drug to everybody in the population. And risk them dying. That's bad for business. Any questions so far? Okay, so to summarize, we said that there was some population we wanted to make a conclusion about, but we're unable to make the conclusion directly. So we gathered a sample, and from that sample, we use statistics to make the conclusion for the whole population. So, in the example we talked about, which we were trying to find what percentage of all Americans approve of the president, we worked out a back of the envelope calculation where we simulated the thought experiment where we would call all 300 million Americans one at a time, and we said it would take on average 3 minutes. And doing that, we said it was completely infeasible. It took on the order of thousands of years. And some of you might wonder, well, that little thought experiment that we did, we called each person one at a time, basically in serial. And you might be wondering, well, that seems impractical. Like nowadays, you can just send out a tweet, and millions of people would respond pretty much in parallel, and we wouldn't have this issue of taking thousands of years. So, any comments about that?
Several. So you got people underseas, you have people who don't have the ability to use electronics. You have people on cruise ships who probably aren't getting that particular message at that time, so your data is going to change in a reflective part all the time.
Okay, very good. So any other comments? Okay, so we were trying to find a quick way, or any way to try to sample every single person in the population, and we said calling them would take thousands of years. But even if you tweet them and you get millions of responses, it's still going to be part of the sample, because not everybody's on Twitter, and even the people that they are, is the sample that ends up arising from all these people tweeting, is that considered a good sample, a representative sample of the population?
No.
No, why not?
Still voluntary to respond.
Yeah, so volunteer bias, and also people who are more prone to using Twitter are probably biased in some way as to whether they accept or whether they approve or don't approve of the president, the one trait that you're trying to answer. So your sample of all Twitter users would end up being skewed and not reflective, not representative of the population. So yeah.
What if like every major phone carrier company or smartphone maker sent out like mass message, like an Amber Alert, but it was like a survey instead.
Okay, very good. So that's a great suggestion. So that, first of all, that'll still be a sample, because it's not gonna be every single person in the country. And then, now the second follow-up question is, would that sample be representative of the population? Would it be considered a good sample? Is it unbiased? Is it random?
There's definitely bias, but it's a big sample.
Okay, good. That's true. It's a big sample, but it's definitely biased, and why is that?
Because only people with enough, like only people that can afford phones would take the survey.
Yeah, basically you're excluding everybody who doesn't use cell phones or chooses not to respond to the Amber Alert. Okay. Good.
You're also assuming that only Americans are going to get that if it's sent out by a major phone company.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. But that said, it depends on what your population is and who you actually are interested in surveying at the end. If all you care about is the opinion of Americans, whether they approve the president, then that's okay. But if your population is the whole world, for example, then an Amber Alert to all Americans would not be a representative sample for the population. Okay, good. So that's review. Any questions so far? Okay, so then we said that the sample that you gather, for it to be a good sample, it needs to be representative of the population, which means that every trait or attribute that you consider to be meaningful for whether somebody approves the president should be in the same proportion in that sample you collect as in the original population. And we said last time that the only way that you can really guarantee that without cherry picking every single attribute, because you'll end up leaving important attributes out anyway, is to make the sample random. And a random sample means that there's no characteristic in which you're favoring for the people who end up being in your sample. So you're not standing in one geographic location, for example. That would be biased in terms of location. You're not calling it only a specific time of the day, or sampling at a specific time of the day. That way you're biasing people who are only available at that time of the day, and so forth. So a random sample means that there are no biases in the sample. And if there are any biases, then you should be able to identify what the biases are. That said, we said that almost every sample that's collected in real life will have at least volunteer bias, because basically that comes down to consent, and you want them to consent in order to not break the law. So at the very least, there's probably going to be volunteer bias. At the end of class last time, we talked about some cases where there weren't volunteer bias, and that's because they probably avoided some kind of loophole. There were internet companies, and so they kind of got around that because the law hasn't caught up. So that said, if a sample has bias, then it's not random. But that said, not all biases are created equal. So if a sample has volunteer bias, only volunteer bias, and that's the best we can do, that's much better than a sample that has dozens of biases. So it's important to be able to identify if a sample has biases and what the biases are, and try to minimize those biases when you're collecting the sample. Okay, so this is one characteristic of a good sample, is that it's representative of the population, i.e. it's random. Any other characteristics you can think of that would make a good sample?
Size.
Okay, good. So size. So let's talk more about that. So let's say that you're trying to answer this question of what percentage of all Americans approves of the president. And you gather this sample, let's say, of 100 people. And of those 100 people, let's say you count each one that says, yes, I approve the president. And let's say that 47 say that they approve. So 47 out of 100 people saying they approve is 47% of the sample. Well, let's say that somebody else is trying to answer the same question of what percentage of all Americans approves the president. And let's say they have a sample of 1,000 people. And let's say in that sample of 1,000 people, 523 people say they approve the president. So as a percentage, that's 52.3%. So now you have two different samples with two different numbers. But what you really care about is what this says about the true percentage of all Americans that approves of the president. So do you think the true percentage will be closer to 47% or 52.3%?
52.3.
Yeah, it'll probably be closer to 52.3% because you have more data points to work with, and those data points are going to, the extreme outliers in each data set will buffer each other out, so you'll get a more consistent result as a whole. So the larger your sample size, the more accurate the conclusion will be for the population. So that said, why not just gather the biggest possible sample size you can, like 10 million people?
Time, effort, resources.
Yeah, so it defeats the whole purpose. It goes back to the original problem that we had before collecting the sample in the first place. So you want a sample size that is large enough to be accurate, because the larger it is, the more accurate it is. But if the sample size is too large, then you run the problem of it being infeasible to collect. So having to poll that many people is a drain on time, money, resources. So you want a sample size that hits the sweet spot of being large enough to be accurate, but not too large to be infeasible. So this second issue of sample size is something that we'll talk a lot more about later in the course. So we're gonna build up to this and then later talk about it in excruciating detail. But this is something to look forward to. The first issue of the sample being random, that's just as important as the size issue in the sample, but this is something that we won't talk about later on this semester. So just keep in mind that this is just as important, but we've already talked about it in detail in all its parts, so we don't need to talk about it anymore. Okay, so once we gathered a good sample that's random and has a large enough size, we're gonna do statistics to try to estimate what the true number is, or the true conclusion is for the whole population. So you might be wondering, well, if you have a good sample to begin with, then a good sample pretty much means that you can trust it to some degree to draw your conclusion. So if you have a good sample in the first place, then why do you need this step of statistics to begin with? If you have a good sample, why not just take the conclusions for that sample at face value and say the answer is that whatever is in the sample?
Due to sample error.
Yeah, very good. Well, okay, good. So let's talk about that. So let's say that you have a sample of 1,000 people and 52.3% say that they approve of the president. Why can't you just say that the true percentage of all Americans that approves of the president is 52.3%?
Compared to what? So,
For all 300 million Americans.
so I agree, you have one person, one company, one platform doing that, but if there's 7 different platforms doing it and all of them post something and maybe 3 of them are close together and the other 3 are different, what's the difference in between, and what's the independent guy that's number 7 have that makes all those numbers different? So what's the difference between the questions when it's being put out the same way, but they all have different results?
Okay, good. So in this example, I just said that we gathered one sample of size 1,000, and you have a result of 52.3% saying that they approve of the president. So we're just looking at one sample, but you're right in saying that if you had gathered different samples of size 1,000, you'd be getting different answers. And so that's one of the reasons why you can't just say the answer is this, because a different sample of the same size, 1,000, you're gonna get a different number. So how can you say that the true percentage in the population is arbitrarily this number?
Okay, so for only one sample, there's a different way to answer that question as
Okay.
well, right? Time, right? Because things change over time and how those policies are affected and how people approve of someone in leadership. So time is a great way to answer that as well.
Okay, but then you can kind of fudge your conclusion to cover yourself for that, because you can say at this moment, when I collected the sample, the true percentage of Americans that approve the president is this number. But why wouldn't that be accurate?
Still not covering everybody.
Yeah, very good, because this is only 1,000 people, and you're still not covering everybody. So the only way this can be perfectly accurate is if you sample all 300 million people. So the reason why we need to have this step of this processing step of statistics is to be able to quantify this uncertainty in the final conclusion. Is basically we're going to say approximately 52.3% of all Americans approve of the president, and then we need to quantify what approximately means. And basically it'll be like some margin of error, like 52.3% plus or minus some margin of error that we end up calculating using statistics. So that's what this statistics step ends up being, even though we end up with a good sample. Is we have to quantify the uncertainty at the end. Questions? Okay, so after we're done collecting a good sample that's random, that's big enough, and then we use statistics to be able to quantify the conclusion and the error, then we want to communicate the results to anybody who's interested in the study. So after the statistics, there's this communication issue. So we need to be able to communicate the proper ideas. And this is just as important as all the other steps in the picture. But this is also something that we'll be done talking about at the end of today. We won't repeat this later on in the semester, but just because it's not repeated doesn't mean it's not as important. The other stuff just takes a lot of build up to it. And this we can talk about right away. So, one of the most important issues involved in communication is this idea of correlation versus causation. So let me just motivate this with an example, and then we'll define each one. So let's say that you're working for the same news organization that asked you to find what percentage of all Americans approve the president. And in this news organization, they happen to notice that in a particular time of the year, at a particular location, there seemed to be a lot of drowning incidents. A lot of people are drowning. But then you also notice that around the same time of year, around the same location, there's also an increase in ice cream sales. So does that mean that eating more ice cream leads to more drowning? No, that's ridiculous, right? So in this example, it's obvious that this is a ridiculous thing. But in real life, this occurs all the time because these two things are occurring together, so this is called correlation. But people often mistake this for causation, because they say that the two things happening together, one is actually leading to the other. Any questions? So this is such an important issue that you actually see it confounded in the news day in and day out, all the time. And so let me just use some examples of things that I've read in the news in the past. So one example is this study that I read. It's a research study. So in this research study, the researchers were interested in answering the question of whether college students who travel internationally are more creative than students who don't travel internationally. And so this was their hunch, their hypothesis that they wanted to test. And so the way they went about testing this idea is they looked at two groups of students, one that traveled, one that didn't travel. And so let's say that they had a sample size. Let's say that these were both considered good samples. So let's say that they had a sample size of 1,000 students for the group who traveled and also 1,000 for the group who didn't travel. And so for each group, they gave a test that was trying to gauge creativity. And let's say that, so you could already argue that there's no test that accurately gauges creativity. But let's say for the sake of argument, there is, and these researchers gave that test. And let's say that the test is calibrated so that above a certain threshold, you're deemed creative, and under that, you're not creative. So let's say that students who traveled, 52% made that threshold, and students who didn't travel, 13% made that threshold. So from the results of the study, these are both samples. So normally what's done is that statistics is used to make a conclusion about whether there's the same difference in the populations of people who travel versus don't travel versus just the samples. So here in the samples, there's how much of a difference, how many fold difference in creativity in traveling versus not traveling. So how many times is 52 versus 13? 4? Yeah, 4 times. So in the samples, there's a 4-fold difference in creativity versus traveling and no traveling. And then statistics is used to certify that this 4-fold difference applies to the populations of people who travel versus don't travel, and not just the samples. And so after the statistics is done, now a conclusion is made, is communicated, and the conclusion that was communicated by these researchers is that traveling leads to higher creativity. So you guys agree with that? Because they argue that that's the only explanation that could possibly have explained this data.
I would definitely argue that one.
Okay, great. Why is that?
Because I know a whole lot of people in the English area that are college students as well, and there are a lot of ways to describe them, and creative is not one of them.
Okay. So, but how does that explain that these subjects who traveled ended up being 4 times more creative, or there were 4 times more creative people who traveled versus didn't travel? What conclusion could possibly explain this data, if not this conclusion?
Well, I think when you travel, you adapt to new cultures around you. So anywhere you go to, you are learning more and more. So they're like, as a result, they become more creative because they're learning so much.
Okay, so that seems to be supporting this conclusion that the researchers made. So basically, so for now, do you guys agree or disagree with that conclusion? Or if you disagree, then what other conclusion could have been made that also supports this data just as well? Okay.
Something else we want.
Maybe more creative people choose to travel more.
Okay, very good. So maybe they're already creative, and people who are more creative just like traveling more, people who don't. So maybe it's the inverse. So, so already there's more than one explanation that fits this data. So you can't just arbitrarily choose that it's the first explanation without testing each one first. So that's the first big mistake that the researchers are making. And at this point, you might be thinking, well, these are professional researchers, so why would they make such a glaring error? So first of all, I'm just writing this alternative conclusion down. So creativity leads to more traveling. So to answer the question of why these researchers would make such a glaring error, is that basically, first of all, they're trying to phrase it in a muddied way. They're saying traveling leads to higher creativity, but this is basically saying causation. That one is leading the other, leading to the other. And the second thing is that often, because when you say that one is leading to the other, that's a lot more glamorous than saying, well, they just happen to co-occur. They just happen to be, they happen to have correlation. That's one thing. And another thing is that by saying that there's causation, researchers are hoping that the reader can't tell the difference. And that happens a lot. Because causation sells more than correlation.
Can't argue that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they say traveling leads to higher creativity for this particular poll, but wouldn't it be that, you know, exposure to other cultures makes you want to travel to see it? So I think it would be something spark their interest and make them want to go there. And the more you see about it, the more you feel about it. So it's just adapting to your environment and imagining new ways to do it. I don't think it's the traveling, I just think it's the exposure. So what they can visually see and model is making them more creative.
Okay, so then you could argue that, well, at that point you could say that hairs are being split, right? You could say that activities involved in traveling are leading to creativity, and whether those activities are exposure to more cultures or other activities involved in traveling, they're still, at the end, leading to higher creativity. But the point is that actually the case, or are there alternative explanations that are fitting the data just as well? And so already, we saw one alternative explanation. So as an exercise, let's come up with as many alternative explanations that we can to fit this data just as well.
I was just gonna say something along the same lines, is that, if it was college students, it would depend on what group of students the trip is being presented to. If it's just one specific class or subject, or if it's the whole school, that would probably affect whether creative people were just wanting to travel versus the whole, sample of students.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
So let's say that I'm playing devil's advocate as being one of the researchers, and I say, well, I'm trying to make it as random as possible by randomly choosing people who travel versus didn't travel. And these are the results I'm seeing, so why can't I conclude that traveling is leading to higher creativity? What other conclusions could there be, if not that? So already we came up with one alternative.
You kind of have to have like spare time to be creative.
Okay, very good.
Your head down working.
Okay, very good. So you could argue then, there could be an alternative narrative that says that people who travel as a whole have more free time, and maybe that free time affords them hobbies and pursuit of creative endeavors. And it's not necessarily the traveling itself, but it's because they have this free time to pursue creative things that they end up being more creative. Like they have time to play the guitar and write poetry, things like that. Okay, so then you can say that this group that travels has this trait being associated with it, which is more free time. So as a whole, people who travel also have more free time, and it's this free time that's actually leading to the high creativity and not the traveling itself. So this other thing that is being associated with this group that's traveling, we call a lurking variable. So lurking means that you're hiding out, right? So this is a variable that's hidden in this group that actually travels, but it's the thing that's actually leading to the creativity. So along this spirit, what other lurking variables do you think are associated with people who travel, which are actually causing the higher creativity?
Money.
Yeah, so give me a story that kind of captures that.
Those who are using it on the no travel are probably, limited by grants, loans, and scholarships to provide for funding, where those who travel were probably being paid for by either trust funds or programs that were previously established for them, and any income that they have is afforded with what time they can find to be able to afford to travel.
Yes, okay, good. So, but how does that income or money actually lead to the higher creativity?
You're not worrying about where your next dollar's coming from. You can
Yeah, you
worry
have
about
the,
other things.
it affords you the headspace, right? Or you could argue that having more money maybe afforded them more educational opportunities throughout their lives, and maybe those things are what leads to the high creativity, not the travel itself. Okay, very good. So money is also an important looking variable here. So people who travel as a whole, you can't argue that they have more money. Everybody would agree to that people who travel as a whole, we're not saying every single person who travels has more money, but as a whole, that group would have more money as a whole. Then that money is affording them more opportunities for them to actually be creative, and it's not the traveling itself. Okay, very good. So we have all these alternative explanations that could actually be the cause of the creativity and not the traveling itself. So each of the alternative explanations, you have to test individually to see whether that's actually the correct conclusion, and you can't just assume arbitrarily that it's one of these over the other. So, given this study, what is the best conclusion that you think can be concluded between these variables, traveling and creativity? So we already said that this was the incorrect conclusion, because this is implying causation. So the most accurate conclusion you can make is traveling is correlated with creativity. All we can say is that they're occurring together. We can't make any judgment about whether one is actually leading to the other. But that said, if we had said that traveling is correlated with creativity, that's not very glamorous. Doesn't sell papers, doesn't get people published. So because of that, researchers try to muddy it, and they try to make a conclusion that sounds like it's causation, and hoping that the reader can't tell the difference. And then for a while, this same study, the same conclusion, I heard it on the news for days. And the same causation conclusion. Okay, so from the study, the best we can conclude is that there's correlation between traveling and creativity. So that said, how do we conclude whether there's the more interesting conclusion of causation? How do we decide whether there's traveling causes or leads to higher creativity? So the main reason we weren't able to reach a causation conclusion before is that if you look at these two groups, if you want to make a conclusion about whether that one thing, traveling is different between the two groups that's leading to the higher creativity, the two groups need to be different only in that one thing, which is the traveling. But in reality, this group who travels has all these other things that are different. These lurking variables are different. The money aspect is different, the time issue is different. So all these other things are different in the traveling group. So if the creativity output ends up being different, then you don't know which of these differences actually resulted in that creativity difference. So that's why we weren't able to conclude that the traveling itself is affecting the creativity. But if you want to conclude causation, you have to make the two groups as a whole the same except for the one traveling issue. Only that one thing can be different between the two groups. So how do we end up forming these two groups so that the only difference is the traveling itself? How do we control for the other variables?
Would we try to provide both groups with money and free time to cancel them out?
You could do that, but then you would end up having to cherry pick what you thought was important. So we would say, okay, we know the money is an issue, so we'll just control for that and give everybody the same amount of money. I mean, that doesn't take into account all the money differences they had throughout their lives, but you're controlling for that moment. But the question is, can you control for all the things? Yeah, so that's one problem we're running into, is that we can't control for all the possible variables. So what else could we do?
Choose from like a similar, social economic level,
Okay.
similar income.
Okay, sure. So in that case, we're not actively controlling, but we're passively controlling by only picking similar groups. But then the question is, can we passively control for all variables again? Yeah, so we keep running into that issue, so, any resolution to that? How do we actually, make a conclusion regarding causation and not just correlation?
How about the number of times?
Okay, so let's say that when we separated these groups, the number of times was accounted for, so if you traveled more than a set number of times, 10 times throughout your life, then that's considered travel, let's say. So that was already defined from the outset. But the issue is, how do we get these two groups to be the same as a whole, except for the one issue of travel? So that if we end up seeing a creativity difference between the two groups, we know it had to come from the traveling and nothing else. Okay, so one possibility is that, let's say that you get, instead of two groups of different students, let's say that you got one group of students, and then basically you did a before and after. Let's say that you tested them before you sent them all off to traveling, and then you send them all off to traveling, and then you test them again. So then, as a whole, those two groups with the same students are the same except for the traveling issue. And if at the end it turns out that there's a marked difference in creativity, you can conclude that that difference had to have come from the one difference in the group, which is whether they traveled or not. So this is what we call a longitudinal study. And basically it's a before and after study. So again, we have a sample of students and it's completely random. So that in this random group, there are students who have traveled and also students who haven't traveled. Unlike before, when you're separating them out into only students who travel versus don't travel. So automatically you're introducing learning variables. So over here, it's completely random. And this is considered the before, where you test their creativity. And then you send the same students off to travel. And then this will be the after group. and then after you travel, they test their creativity. And if there's a big difference between their creativity in both groups, you can conclude that difference had to have come from the one thing that was different, which was the travel. Now, the people who conducted these studies were professional researchers, so they knew that this was a way to reach a conclusion about correlation, or about causation versus just correlation. So why do you think that the researchers didn't do this kind of study? And why did they end up doing the previous study?
Money.
Okay, so why does the second one cost more?
So there you got your random selected, and for whatever your control group is gonna be, you're sending these, sending the sample off to travel wherever that destination happens to be, which also doesn't act like the other one where they went where they wanted, but here they're being forced to a particular part, so your result is where they traveled already made it biased for what they're exposed to and then what's coming back. You've got this group at the bottom or after with a portion that did not get to go, and those whoever went where it was funded to go for X amount of time based on the finances provided for the study. It also makes your group smaller because of that financing.
Okay, very good. So when you send all these students to travel, it costs a lot of money. And then you're hoping that they come back so that you can complete the study. And so it takes both time and money for this to occur. Versus, if you look at the previous study, this was purely passive, where basically people who walk through the street, they just pick out these people one at a time and say, did you travel? Okay, great, I'm gonna put you in this group. Did you not travel? I'm gonna put you in this group. So it's purely passive. You're not actually sending them off to travel. And this kind of passive study, we call an observational study, because you're just observing people, you're not actually experimenting. So this is an observational study. So in observational studies, they're done much more often because of this issue that they're much easier to conduct. It's much faster, it takes a lot less money to conduct an observational study. But that said, the best you can conclude with an observational study is correlation. Okay, so let's do another example. So nowadays, there's a lot of concern about whether cell phones cause brain tumors, because everybody's using a cell phone now. And to this day, we don't have a definitive conclusion on that. So let's talk about why. And let's talk about, so far, how people have gone about trying to answer that question. So what's done is that researchers will often look at two groups of people, one who uses cell phones and so let's say using a cell phone, like there are certain criteria, like you have to use a cell phone up to your ear for a certain number of hours a day, and that constitutes using a cell phone. And so let's say that this other group does not use cell phones. And let's say that you have, quote, good samples for both. They're both random and large enough sample size. So let's say that you collect 1,000 people in each group. and then you bring them under an MRI machine to see whether they have brain tumors. So let's say the group who uses cell phones, you have 12 people in that group who ends up having brain tumors. And let's say the group who doesn't use cell phones, you have 2 people in that group who has brain tumors. So the sample who uses cell phones apparently has a lot more people as brain tumors in the other group. But this is just for the samples. So let's say in real life, then statistics would be used to conclude whether there's the same difference for the populations of people who uses cell phones versus doesn't use cell phones. And so let's say that after statistics is used, it's concluded that for the populations or everybody who uses cell phones, there's also a 6-fold difference in brain tumors between not using a cell phone. So in that case, what can we communicate now? Can we say that based on this study, that using cell phones leads to higher incidences of brain tumors? No, why?
I've got several ideas in mind. One is exposure, because it could be, being around other people using it would be just as damaging as you being the one using it, so you can't determine it.
Okay.
2, what else are those people exposed to other than cell phones that could have the potential of causing tumors? 3, what's the medical history on any of these people that would give you that conclusion? Is there any genetic factors that actually could make a brain tumor run in their family, be part of their genetics instead of using a cell phone? Correlate, sure. Causation, I don't buy that.
Okay, so those are all valid points. But to really cut into this argument is basically saying, well, based on this data, it seems like the only valid explanation is that cell phones end up leading to higher brain tumors. So it's causation. So the most effective counter-argument is to be able to come up with another explanation that explains this data just as well. So what other explanation can you give? If it's not the brain tumors, if it's not the cell phones that are causing the brain tumors, what else could explain this data?
What is just like the general percentage of people that have brain tumors worldwide? You know, like,
Okay.
is 12 out of 1,000 really necessary, or is it like really that high?
Okay, good point. So maybe compare it with another group where it's completely random, that consists of both people who use and doesn't use cell phones, and see what that difference is. Okay, but let's say that just for this study with these numbers, what other explanation could you draw that fits this data just as well? Because researchers are going to argue that that's the only explanation that could fit this data. So the best way to counter-argue that is to come up with another explanation. And we don't know which of the alternative explanations is true, but the point is that there's not only one explanation that you have to accept just because that one explanation fits the data.
I mean, do they use microwaves? Because, that's something they could probably do it. What RF exposure are they around that also produces the same signals that a cell phone would do? Alright, so you've got operation of a vehicle with the Wi-Fi adaptability and the maps that come up on it. You've got all sorts of stuff in your house that does the same thing, including your computer, your television now. There's a lot of different things that you could point that to say all these people are probably using something that has the same capability as a cell phone.
Okay. So all we know is we gathered 1,000 random people who used cell phones regularly and 1,000 people who didn't use cell phones, And we're seeing that there are a lot more brain tumors in people who are using cell phones. So, what could explain that besides the most obvious explanation that cell phones are actually causing the brain tumors?
Maybe the age groups of the samples would come into play, because it's gonna be either kids or older people who usually don't use cell phones. Maybe the people who do use cell phones have had more exposure to microwaves, to updated technology where there's more like, exposure to those kind of waves.
Okay, very good. So just like with the traveling creativity example, you could say that as a whole, this group of people who use the cell phones has lurking variables associated with them. So people who use cell phones, as a whole, are more exposed to other things and not just cell phones. They're exposed to like microwaves and other types of electromagnetic radiation. And so, because of that, maybe those other kinds of electromagnetic radiation are actually causing the brain tumors and not just the cell phone use itself. So, we're gonna do the same thing as before, identify possible lurking variables. So, other radiation is one. So people who use cell phone are also more prone to other radiation, as opposed to people who don't use cell phones as a whole. So this is one alternative explanation, is the other radiation could be causing the brain tumor. What's another?
You said age range.
Okay, good. So people who don't use cell phones, maybe they're on the extreme age brackets where they're either very young or very old, and maybe they're less prone to getting tumors, and it's because of the fact that they're in these age demographics that they're not getting the age tumors, that they're not getting the tumors, and not because of using the cell phones. Okay, good. So what other lurking variables?
The access to cell phones,
What do you mean?
some people may not have access to them, like technology around the world, some people may not have it.
Okay, so how's that explaining that the people who are using the cell phones end up being observed with more tumors versus people who don't use cell phones, they have less tumors? Okay, maybe I'll give you another one. So do you agree that as a whole, people who use cell phones have more stress in their lives than people who don't use cell phones? And maybe it's because of the stress that's leading to the tumors. So that's another lurking variable. What else? Or you could argue that maybe people who use cell phones live in more rural areas and they live quieter, quainter lives. And maybe it's because of that they don't have tumors. That they're not, people who live in rural areas aren't exposed to pollution. And because of that, they don't have as many tumors. So people who don't use cell phones, there's also less pollution. What else you guys can think of?
Personal use of drugs. So you're using any carcinogens that are legal, is that tied into there as well?
Yeah, so if you can build a narrative around that, then yeah, it would apply. So if you can say that people who use cell phones as a whole also use more types of drugs, painkillers, or legal or otherwise, and if that's actually true, then yeah, you could definitely make that argument that people who use cell phones use more different types of drugs, and those things are causing or leading to higher tumors and not the cell phone use itself. Okay, so that's another example of a lurking variable. What else? So would you agree that people who use cell phones have busier lives, and because of that, not only do they have more stress, but maybe they end up eating more processed food, more fast food, and maybe all that processed food is leading to higher incidence of tumors, and not just the cell phone use itself.
I'm sitting there thinking about the people themselves and what they're doing, not what they're consuming.
Yeah, and so because of all these lurking variables, this is what's actually makes correlation versus causation just such an issue. So, so let's say processed food. So because of these two groups, using cell phones versus not using cell phones, they end up having, the cell phone group ends up having 6 times more tumors, but there's all these other differences in the groups, in the two groups, and not just the cell phone use. There's the other radiation, the stress, the processed food, the pollution aspect. So if there is a brain tumor difference, you don't know which of these factors is actually the main factor. So because of that, you can't just pick one arbitrarily and say it's because of the cell phones that's leading to more tumors. So the best you can say as a result of the study is you can say there's this correlation between cell phone use and brain tumors. You can't say that there's causation because you can't identify which of these other factors is actually the true cause. So that said, how do we conclude causation and not just correlation?
Causation would have to have a definitive result that explains why one thing is causing this in a large group repetitively.
Yes, and also the way to go about that is to have both of these groups the same as a whole in everything except for that one thing that you're trying to show as causation. So except for using cell phones. So right now we don't have that because these two groups are different not only in the cell phone use, but they're different in all these other lurking variables as well. But we want to design a study where we have these two groups be as a whole the same except for the one difference of one group uses cell phones and the other doesn't. So how do you think we can design such a study where we end up communicating the right thing?
By using the test to make sure people have the things in common that would affect the study beforehand and after.
Yeah, good. So to use this study that we said, measuring causation and not just correlation. So this before and after study where you have these two groups consisting of the same people, the only difference is that whether they use cell phones or not. So let's try this example. So you have this random group of people, and so you before you were testing them for creativity, and now you're testing them for brain tumors under an MRI. And then you induce that causative agent. So instead of traveling, now you give everybody cell phones to use for an extended period of time. But we don't know how long it takes to develop a brain tumor. So you're gonna have to have them use cell phones for a long time, and we might be talking about decades here. So a long period of time, and then after that long period of time has transpired, then you test them for brain tumors. So our hope in doing this is that these two groups end up being, as a whole, the same, except for that one difference of using cell phones. So let's say that at the end of all this time, you test them and you see something similar. One group has 2% tumors, the other group has 12% tumors. So can you conclude that because the second group, consisting of the same people, but the only difference is that they use cell phones, there's a 6-fold difference, so can you conclude that that difference is because they use cell
It would
phones?
make sense to say that with causation.
Okay, you guys agree? So we can only conclude that if these two groups are the same as a whole, except for that one difference. if there's any other difference, then that other difference might have contributed to it, and not the cell phone use. So of these two differences, the before and after, with all this time that transpired, is there only a difference in cell phone use and nothing else?
No,
Okay, what else can we do?
maybe they changed their way of life or,
Yeah, they changed their way of life, or they just got older,
yeah.
right? And maybe that old age is causing the brain tumors and not the cell phone use during this time. So this is different from the traveling creativity example from before, because now the before and after group is very different in time. A lot of time has elapsed. In the traveling creativity example, you're assuming that you're sending them off for only a couple months, and that'll be negligible. But in this case, you have this big issue of time being an issue as well. Any questions? So another question is, since a longitudinal study would not be appropriate for measuring causation here, what else can we do? So there's actually a second way that we could do it to try to measure causation. This is called the controlled study. So if we compare that to the observational study, where the two groups we arbitrarily divided them out into using cell phones and not, so that the using cell phones group had all these other differences in it as well, these lurking variables. Instead of doing it like that, let's have two groups, but both are completely random. So both groups are random. So now, as a whole, the two groups are exactly the same. They have the same percentages of people with every characteristic you can think of. And you're assuming the sample size is large enough so that you have this effect of both groups being the same in every aspect. So let's say that you have 1,000 people in each group.
But the only difference is one has cell phones and the other doesn't.
Well, right now, you don't even have that difference. Both are exactly the same, so they have the same percentage of people who have used cell phones, the same percentage of people who have a cancer, same percentage of people who are rich, poor, and so on. So then what you do is you induce that one difference that you wanted to show is the causative agent. So you induce cell phone use in only one group. But now you have to give that group, allow them to use cell phones for enough time for them to possibly develop any tumors. So now you let them use cell phones for decades. With that time factor, that decades that has elapsed, you have to give that same amount of time to the other group as well. So now both groups are the same, except for that one issue of using cell phones. So at the end of all that time, and using cell phones for the first group, then you test them for tumors. And then if the tumors are markedly different in the group that use cell phones, then you can conclude that that had to have come from that one difference, which are using cell phones.
Are they doing a before and after image of their brains with, after the cell phone use and the other side?
They don't have to, so they can just do the tests immediately afterwards. So this is a longitudinal study where you do it before and after on the same group. But here we're doing two different groups that as a whole are the same, and then you just test once at the end. So this is what we call a control study. And this would also have been appropriate in the traveling creativity example from before, where you get two different groups of students and then induce traveling in one of the groups and then test them. So we said that in this example with cell phones and tumors, of these two options that people usually use to gauge causation, the second one is the only one that would be appropriate here, because The longitudinal study, we said, had this time issue, that would make, the two groups not the same, the before and after group not the same on the time issue. So this, controlled study is the only appropriate causation study in this example. So I said before that to this day, we still don't have a definitive answer on whether cell phones cause brain tumors. So why do you think that is, based on what we talked about?
Because it takes too long.
Yeah, why does it take too long? So what aspect did we just talk about why it takes long?
Because of all of the data and stuff you have to collect when you need cell phones.
Yeah, but mainly, this issue of giving them cell phones for decades, enough time for them to possibly develop any tumors, that's what's taking the longest, right? So by taking long, we mean like decades, 30 years, 40 years. And so because of that, cell phones haven't been even around that long. So because of that, we still don't have a definitive answer yet, because we don't have this decades that has passed for us to observe that. Okay, so so that said, year after year, people continually do these correlation studies on cell phones and brain tumors, and year after year, they're getting the same results, is that there's correlation between brain tumors and cell phones. So, first of all, if we know that this kind of study, this observational study, the best conclusion we can have is a correlation conclusion and not a causation conclusion, then why do you think people continue to do these kinds of correlation studies over and over if you end up getting a weak conclusion anyway?
It looks good, it sells.
Yeah, it makes it seem like they're doing something.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily useless information. You can still make inferences based off the numbers.
Okay, good. So what kind of inferences do you think?
Like the lurking variables that we found.
Okay, very good. So, so let's say that this correlation study, this observational study, is done year after year, which is actually what's going on. And let's say that year after year, 10 years in a row, we see correlation between cell phones and brain tumors. Then, is there a certain point at which you can say, well, there's enough correlation going on that there's probably causation? Do you think that we can say that? Can we say that after 10 years of correlation, at the 11th year, we could probably conclude causation? Yeah, because the correlation could have happened with any of these lurking variables. It could be stress or processed food that's leading to the tumors. So just because there's lots of correlation year after year, doesn't mean that
Any of the lurking variables went away.
any of the lurking variables went away. Very good.
I'm sitting there, it's like, I can't really argue that it could be the phone, because if they're upgrading their phones, they're getting more efficient on how they're using and broadcasting both, microwaves, EMI, and RF energy, so.
Sure.
You know, they're not pulling out that block from the 80s and that out of the car that, you know, was the original cell phone that was, 90% battery, so. It's still really hard to prove that the cell phone is what is actually causing the tumor.
Okay, good. So one reason why researchers year after year are conducting these correlation studies, even though they know that the best they can reach is a weak conclusion, one reason they're doing it is because they're getting funding for it and they're doing it to keep their jobs. That's one reason. A correlation conclusion is better than no result at all, especially if the public, the audience doesn't know the difference between the two. But do you think, so that's kind of like a shady reason to begin with. But do you think there might be any benevolent reasons to continue with these correlation studies year after year?
Trying to say this in a good way, right? So Innovation is normally brought about because of necessity. If they can find a better way to communicate than instead of using cell phones, that doesn't have anything associated with, that will normally go. The other part behind those studies is, being benevolent or not, three things normally sell really, really well.
What sells really well?
Fear, ways to cure things, things that entice, entertain, or bring pleasure. And in any way that you can tie something to that, it will normally sell very well.
Okay, good. So that's true, but that said, that those aren't very benevolent reasons. So again, that kind of ties into researchers doing it to sell things, to save their own jobs. What other reasons do you think might be a more benevolent reason where they're conducting these studies year after year, in the hopes of only getting a lukewarm conclusion at the end?
I think when you do it over and over again and they get the result that they want to the audience, it will start to look very true, so they're gonna start believing it more and more each year.
Well, yeah, that's true too. That's also not a very benevolent reason,
Propaganda.
but that's true. Propaganda, that's not very benevolent.
We tried.
Yeah.
To stay, on track with any minor changes, so that way, if the curve does go towards causation, they'll be able to pinpoint right when it does.
Okay, you're on the right track. So let's say that these correlation studies are done year after year, and let's say that 1 year the study is done and a research group concludes that there's no correlation between using cell phones and having brain tumors. So let's say that this conclusion is also replicated by other research groups around the world. They're able to replicate the conclusion there's no correlation between cell phones and brain tumors. So if there's no correlation, then what do you think can be said about causation? If there's no correlation, can there be causation?
No,
Yeah, what's it?
because there's no causation.
Yeah, causation is actually a very specific form of correlation. Correlation just means that they're related.
Yeah.
So how can you have that such an intimate relationship, causation, if they're not even related in the first place? Good. So causation is just a very specific form of correlation. So if there's no correlation to begin with, there can't possibly be causation. So that's a more benevolent reason to why these correlation studies are done year after year, because if you can conclude, and it can be replicated, that there's no correlation between two variables, then you don't have to worry about doing these more expensive, time-consuming studies anymore. You can stop. You don't have to worry about causation anymore if there is no correlation to begin with. Okay, any questions? But that said, year after year, we keep seeing correlation between cell phones and brain tumors. But again, we don't have a definitive conclusion about whether there is actually causation. So that's correlation versus causation, and now that we talk about it, I think that when you read the news, you'll start seeing this pop up over and over, is the news, and people seem to confound correlation and causation, and you'll see these studies that are being provided as evidence. And all these studies are just observational studies. They're just observing things passively and saying that one seems to lead to the other. And now you know that with an observational study, the best conclusion you can make is correlation and not causation. Okay, so that's the first issue of communication, is correlation versus causation. And so the second is something that will be short. It's this issue of the source of the study. So again, this is under communication issues. After we've used the statistics and we want to communicate the proper results. One is correlation versus causation. And so, as an example, I think this is an example in your book, but have you heard of the brand Kiwi? So not the fruit, but the brand?
Yes.
Yeah, what do they make?
Boot polish.
Yeah, boot polish or shoe polish, good. So they actually conducted a study years ago where the conclusion they ended up making was, for all people who ended up not receiving a job offer after their interview, the number one reason was because their shoes weren't shiny. And so this came from a shoe polish company that reported that conclusion. And so you would kind of expect that because it's in their best interest to make that conclusion. So this happens all the time in real life in more subtle ways. Like you might see a study that is sponsored by a drug company, but the drug company itself didn't actually conduct the study. Maybe they had a prestigious university have the study, but the drug company still paid the university. So people aren't usually gonna bite the hand that fed them. So this happens a lot in real life where you have to pay attention to where the source of the study came from because that could influence the conclusions. Any questions? All right, so that's actually it for today. Make sure to do the homework that is due tomorrow night by midnight. And this is the first homework, so it'll be really short. It'll only take you like 15, 20 minutes.
Yesterday was like 6 questions.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so you did the one yesterday, I think that's the same one that's due today, or due tomorrow. So there's only one homework that's due tomorrow. And if you already did it, then you did it.
Have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
All right, take care.